Hi, this is an introduction to philosophy where we examine some of the ultimate questions that philosophers ask. My name is Mark Thorsby, and today we're going to be looking at is this question, what is reason? This is the second part of a two-part video series. The first question we looked at logic and some of the basic elements of logic. Today we're going to be looking at what are known as fallacies. A fallacy is a false argument, and we're going to see that they're actually very common. So let me pull up my screen here. So welcome back, everyone. Again, we're talking about informal fallacies. So I'm just going to jump right into it here. There are two types of fallacy that are possible. Now, a fallacy, again, is a false argument. And if you recall from our previous videos, we made a distinction between deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. For the most part, though it's not precisely identical, this distinction corresponds to the difference between formal logic and informal logic. That's not exactly precisely the case, but that's, I think, good enough for you to understand. Because here's the idea, is that a deductive argument is an argument out of necessity. If it's an argument out of necessity, that means that the premises are necessarily related to the conclusion. So we can determine whether or not that is true in a deductive argument by evaluating the form of that argument and determining whether or not that form is such that it allows for illogicality or it allows for false conclusion despite having true premises. So let me give you an example of a formal fallacy. This one's called affirming the consequent. It's a very, very frequent and common fallacy. And don't be too worried about the symbolism here. This sort of greater than symbol, it means if then. It's called a conditional. So what this means is if P, then Q, Q, therefore P. So let me give you an example if I was going to write it out. It'd be something like, if you smoke cigarettes, then you're going to get cancer. You got cancer, therefore you must be smoking cigarettes. You can see automatically that that's an invalid argument, right? And it's invalid because obviously there's other ways you could have got cancer. Or in other words, there's other ways that Q could potentially be derived other than Q. I'm sorry, I got my language confused. There's other ways in which Q can be derived other than P, right? So this is affirming the consequent. Let me give you another good example here called denying the antecedent. Now, just so you know, the first part of any conditional statement, this is an if-then statement. So the first part is called the antecedent, and the second part here is called the consequence. And what does that mean? It means that if this thing exists prior to this thing, it will cause this thing to happen. So if P, then Q. So here again, the example is if you smoke cigarettes, then you're going to get cancer. Then this sort of squiggly symbol, that means negation or not. So this says if P, then Q, not P, therefore not Q. So if you smoke cigarettes, then you're going to get cancer. You're not smoking cigarettes, therefore you're not going to get cancer. Well, that's a formal fallacy because any argument to take this form is wrong because why? Just because P is not present doesn't mean that Q is not present, right? There's other ways to get cancer, if you will, right? So these are very common fallacies now, and they're fallacies because ultimately the form is the problem. Now, but another type of logic is informal logic. Now, in our video last time, we made this distinction again between deductive reasoning, reason by probability, and inductive reasoning. Now, whereas in deductive reasoning, you inspect the form of the argument to determine whether or not it's a good argument, in inductive logic, we can't rely on the form because, for instance, we're making predictions about the future and this sort of thing, and ultimately, whether or not the argument is valid depends upon the content of the ideas in the argument, right? So, for instance, well, let me give you an example here, right? The Brooklyn Bridge is made of atoms. Atoms are invisible, right, to the naked eye. Therefore, the Brooklyn Bridge is invisible to the naked eye. Now, this argument obviously is ludicrous because the Brooklyn Bridge is made of atoms, but obviously the Brooklyn Bridge is not invisible. So what's going on? Well, let's take a look at the form of the argument. The form of the argument says if P then Q, if Q then R, therefore if P then R. So something like if, let me give you an example. if you don't drink water, then you'll be thirsty, and if you're thirsty, then you might get sick. Therefore, if you don't drink water, you might get sick, right? Or something like that. You can see the argumentative form actually is known as a hypothetical syllogism, and this is known as a valid argument form. And by valid, just to remind you what we talked about last time, by valid what we mean is that if the premises are true, the conclusion must necessarily be true. Now, here's the problem, is that our Brooklyn Bridge problem is exactly in this form, right? If it's a Brooklyn Bridge, then it's made of atoms. If it's made of atoms, then it's invisible. Therefore, if it's the Brooklyn Bridge, it's invisible, right? So the problem with the argument isn't the form, right? It's an unsound argument. Remember, we made the distinction, valid arguments can be unsound. An unsound argument is an argument that's valid, but it's not really true. And the idea here is that in order to detect the fallacy, the false step in reasoning, you have to know something about the conceptual content. You have to know something about bridges, and you have to know something about atoms, right? Namely that bridges are large objects, and the atoms, while they're invisible individually, collectively they're not, right? So you have to know something about the actual ideas. So that means that fallacies that invoke mistakes in reasoning are referred to in this sense in Latin as non sequiturs. And perhaps you've heard that term, right? It's a frequent legal term, in fact. A non sequitur just means it doesn't follow. That is, the conclusion, the claim you're making doesn't follow from the premises or the evidence you've given. So that's what a non sequitur is. And in a certain sense, every fallacy is a non sequitur, right? Though people make the distinction. Now, there are actually 4 distinct categories of informal fallacies. We're only going to be looking at a couple of them today, and we're not going to look at all of them, but there are 4 distinct types of informal fallacies. The first type of informal fallacy is known as what is called a fallacy of relevance. So fallacies of relevance occur when essentially the premises or the reasons given right, are irrelevant to the conclusion. Or in other words, fallacies of irrelevance share the common characteristic that the arguments in which they occur have premises that are logically irrelevant to the conclusion, but oftentimes they appear psychologically relevant. And this is one of the things I think that's very important about logic, is that most of us forget that everywhere we go, we're surrounded in modern life by arguments. Advertisers are constantly telling us why we should buy what we want to buy. Our boss is telling us how we should work and why. Our pastors are telling us how we should live morally and why, and so on and so forth. We're surrounded, we're inundated with arguments. And a lot of times what we're going to see is that the reasons people give us, they're psychologically relevant, that is, they pull at our heartstrings, if you will, but they're actually logically irrelevant. And so what I'm going to do here is give you some examples of some of these here in a moment. But before I do that, here are the other 3 types of fallacies. Besides fallacies of irrelevance, there's fallacies of weak induction. Now remember, induction means the probability of inference from the evidence to the claim, or from the premises to the conclusion. Here's the technical definition. Fallacies of weak induction occur when the link between the premises and the conclusion is too weak. Pretty simple, right? So these are fallacies, for instance, where I say, because you've been buying, every year, your whole life, you've been buying, every night before you go to bed, you go and buy a lotto ticket. Because you're always buying lotto tickets, it's likely you'll win the lottery next week, right? That's obviously a weak argument, because the premises don't actually infer the conclusion, right? So it's improbable. The other type, and I'm going to talk about those first 2 today. We're not going to talk about these in the video, but there are other types of fallacies. The next one here is fallacies of presumption, ambiguity, and weak induction. And these occur when the premises presume the conclusion. These are known as circular arguments, or begging the question is a famous example. A second is when an argument uses terms that are ambiguous, right? So for instance, if you make an argument where you're using a term in 2 different ways, that's known as the fallacy of equivocation, right? Or there's also of ambiguity, and then there's also when the grammar of an argument hides a fallacious relation. So there's even some arguments where the grammar makes it sound good, but it's actually not. And then finally, there's fallacies of ordinary language, and this is really just the catch-all phrase for the majority of informal fallacies that actually exist, and they occur in ordinary language. One of the things about logic is that logic, well, it helps us reveal this sort of fundamental structure about how we can think correctly in terms of inference and this sort of thing. Most of the arguments we give in real life are so complicated that logic is really unable to capture what we're doing. And so there's many other types of fallacies that we don't really have a category for. We just call these fallacies of ordinary language. This is essentially everything else, which is quite a bit of stuff actually. So let's jump in here and talk about fallacies of relevance, because today I'll talk about fallacies of relevance, and then we'll move on and we'll talk about fallacies of weak induction. So to identify a fallacy of relevance, though, you have to be able to distinguish genuine evidence from essentially different types of emotional appeal, right? This is in the first video on logic, I talked about psychologists who distinguish two systems in consciousness: the fast system, the slow system. The fast system is the system where you experience the world and understand the world, and very, very quickly make decisions without thinking about them. The slow system is the thinking system. One of the things about the arguments that use emotional appeal in these fallacies is that they appeal to our fast system. We hear something that makes us feel a certain way, and then we want to believe the conclusion, even though if we sit down and think it through, we recognize that there's no relevance to what's actually being promoted and what's being said, given as a reason. So let me just run through some of the very common forms of these fallacies of relevance. The first is called the appeal to force, and here's the Latin term, argumentum ad baculum. That means appeal to the stick, literally in Latin. And this is the fallacy of appeal to force occurs whenever an arguer poses a conclusion to another person and tells that person, either implicitly or explicitly, that some harm is going to come to them if they don't accept the idea, right? This is that if you don't agree with me, I'm going to hit you in the head, right? Now, appeal to force, of course, this is a very simple fallacy. No one should believe this is reasonable, but you can imagine that many people succumb to this because, namely, they don't want to get hurt. So appeal to force occurs actually more frequently than you might even think. Here's an example. If you don't give me a raise within the next month, you might just show up to work and discover that the building is burned down. Right? That's an example of appeal to force, because I'm basically threatening you if you don't agree with me, right? There's a great example of this in the Fight Club, I think, where he threatens his boss and all this. He gets all this money and this sort of thing. I think there are a couple movies do these examples, right? So there's the appeal to force. Clearly, that's not really a good reason to believe anything simply because someone threatens you. And so that's not a fallacy most of us probably succumb to. The appeal to pity, however, is one of these. Now, the appeal to pity fallacy occurs when an arguer attempts to support a conclusion by simply invoking pity from the reader or the listener. And the pity can be directed either to the listener or to a third party, right? Basically, this is called the argumentative ad misericordiam, right? Miseries. It's the argument by misery, essentially is what it means. And this actually occurs quite a bit, actually. You'd be surprised. Think about, here's a facility example, but then I'll give you an actual example. Your Honor, I admit that I declared 13 children as dependents on my tax return, even though I only have 2, but if you find me guilty of tax evasion, I'll be ruined. I'll lose my job. My wife won't be able to have her operation. My kids will starve. Surely I can't be guilty, right? You can see here that he or she is trying to, I guess it's a he since it's a husband, he's trying to convince the judge, right, that for emotional reasons he should be determined as not guilty, right? That clearly is an emotional appeal, pulling on the heartstrings here. Now, well, let me give you one more example here that's a real example, so I don't have that's not typed up. But for instance, I remember a couple years ago after that horrible earthquake in Haiti, right, just horrible, I'd be watching TV and suddenly the TV commercial would come on and all you'd see are just these pictures of these people crushed in the rubble in Haiti. And then after a couple of scenes of that, then they would say, donate now, right? And the argument there is you should donate money because these people are suffering. That's the implicit argument. But you can see the fact that people are suffering doesn't necessarily imply that I must give money, right? There's got to be more to fill in the link there. So the argument's actually a fairly weak argument. But you can see when I actually see people suffering, I think, oh yeah, I really should do it, right? So, and I actually did go and donate money, right? So you can see here that the appeal to pity gets used quite a bit, and in many ways, we find it persuasive, right? At least those arguments can persuade us to act differently. And the idea here is that that's not actually logical. Now here's the third type of appeal, fallacy of relevance, and that's called the appeal to the people, argumentatum ad populum. This is essentially the everyone's doing it argument, right? So this operates by using desires that people want, right? That generally people want, and then linking those desires into the argument so you'll accept their conclusion, right? So let's go through an example here. In fact, there's three principal types, though there are more as well. The first one's called the bandwagon argument. And this is essentially everyone's doing it, so you should do it too, right? And this is a real example. Of course you want to buy Crest toothpaste. 90% of America brushes with Crest. Now, these are very popular. It's basically the popularity argument. But you can see that argument actually sounds like, well, maybe I should if everyone else is. But think, 90% of Americans could have bad teeth, right? So just because 90% of Americans are doing it doesn't mean that that's the right toothpaste to buy, right? Appeal to vanity. This is when you're trying to get other people, for instance, advertisers use this to get people to buy their products, right? The most beautiful women choose L'Oreal. What's the inference there? The inference is that the most beautiful people choose L'Oreal, so if you choose L'Oreal, you'll be beautiful. That's actually a fallacy as well, right? It means that yeah, it's a fallacy actually if we did a formal analysis as well as an informal analysis. But the idea here is that the psychology is irrelevant ultimately to whether or not you should actually buy L'Oreal's products. Or appeal to snobbery. This one doesn't occur as frequently, but it does occur, right? A Rolls Royce is not for everyone. If you qualify as one of the select few, this distinguished classic may be seen and driven at British Motor Cars Limited, right? LTD, by appointment only. Right? That sort of argument is appealing essentially to people's snobbery. But all three of these arguments are examples of the argumentative ad populum. And usually we just call it an ad populum argument for short. The next here is known as what's the argumentative ad hominem. And this is known as the against the person fallacy. And this fallacy always involves usually two arguers, at least implicitly. And one of them advances a certain type of argument, and the other responds to it. By directing his or her attention not to the first person's argument, but to the person themselves. All of us, if you've ever had a sibling, you've done this, you've seen this fallacy live, right? This is the, no, if you don't agree with me, you're just an idiot kind of argument, to simplify it completely here. But let me give you some examples. There's actually three types of ad hominems. The first is known as the abusive ad hominem. So that's, for instance, before he dies, Podell and Ginsburg argued, before he died, I should say. Podell and Ginsburg argued in favor of legalizing pornography, but Ginsburg's arguments are nothing but trash. He's a pot-smoking homosexual and a thoroughgoing advocate of drug culture. You can see here that this argument, if Allen Ginsburg is making the argument for legalizing pornography, this argument is saying we shouldn't legalize pornography because Ginsburg is a bad man, right? But that's just abusive. They're just attacking Allen Ginsburg. They're not actually addressing the issue of legalized pornography. Now, obviously, that case is over. It's a very old case. But anyway, the second type of ad hominem is known as a circumstantial. And this is the idea when you argue against someone else's circumstances, right? So you say, of course President Bush wants to invade Iraq. Iraq has the world's second largest oil supply, and he's from an oil tycoon family, right? It's the fact that he's from an oil family and the fact that Iraq has a large oil supply is not logically inferentially necessary, meaning that just because he's from the tycoon family doesn't mean that that's why he's invading Iraq, right? That these two issues, the circumstances of his life are irrelevant to the invasion of Iraq itself, right? So this is called a circumstantial ad hominem. And then the final one here is called the U2 fallacy. Oops. Let me pause this. We'll take a look at that here in a second. The last fallacy here is the, I'm losing control of this video here. It's called the tu quo quo fallacy, the U2 fallacy. And this is the argument that the hypocrite's fallacy. It's the same. You shouldn't believe him because he's a hypocrite, right? You too do it as well. Your argument that I should stop stealing candy from the corner store is no good. You told me yourself just spirals out of control. But this is a good example of how the ad hominem fallacies, it's hard to take them seriously, but they're quite common actually. Okay. Now, if there was a sort of writing exercise I'd normally give in a face-to-face class, I'm not going to do that. So let's move on, and I want to talk a little about some other fallacies here. Another one here is called the fallacy of accident. And here's what we're going to be talking about is the fallacy of accident is committed when a general rule is applied to a specific case in which it was not intended to cover. I'm not sure why there's text missing here, right? So a fallacy of accident is when you take a general rule and then you apply the general rule to something that that rule doesn't actually apply to, right? So let me just give you an example here. The freedom of speech is a constitutionally guaranteed right. Therefore, John Smith should not be arrested for yelling fire in a crowded theater, right? The idea that we have rules that protect free speech doesn't apply to every case, right? It doesn't apply to cases of emergencies, for instance. Here's another example. Property should be returned to its rightful owner. That drunken sailor who's starting a fight with his opponents at the pool table lent you his .45 caliber pistol, and now he wants it back. Therefore, you should return it to him now, right? So the fallacy of accident, it's a sort of funny example, but the fallacy of accident is when I have irrelevant premises to the conclusion, and the irrelevance concerns the idea of a misapplied rule, okay? Misapplied rule. Now, the straw man fallacy is another one of these fallacies. You'll notice that the first couple of fallacies I gave you had Latin names. These fallacies don't have Latin names. That's because the Latin name fallacies were actually originated from the Middle Ages. And in the Middle Ages, they recognized these other fallacies, but they didn't give them the same names, or I'm not giving you all the names, so don't worry about the Latin. So we have the fallacy, so we've talked about that ad hominem fallacy now, and then the fallacy of accident. The next is the straw man fallacy. The straw man fallacy is committed when you distort an opponent's view, and then you attack the distortion. So for instance, the idea here is I build a straw man version of you and I attack that and then say, so therefore you shouldn't believe Joe's ideas, right? That's like, for instance, saying, don't take, let's see here. Well, essentially a straw man fallacy is when I have to first distort the view of my opponent. Let me give you an example, actually. Mr. Goldberg has argued against prayer in the public schools. Obviously, Mr. Goldberg advocates atheism, but atheism is what they used to have in Russia. Atheism leads to this suppression of all religions and the replacement of an omnipotent state. Is that what we want for our country? I hardly think so. Clearly, Mr. Goldberg's argument is nonsense. You can see here that Mr. Goldberg, if he's arguing against prayer in school, it's unlikely that he also is actually really arguing atheism in Russia and the idea of a totalitarian state and all this sort of things. Goldberg, right, whoever's making this argument is distorting Goldberg's ideas and attacking the distortion, right, rather than attacking his actual ideas. A good example of this happens, for instance, when people say, oh, you shouldn't believe the pro-choice people. They think that we should just murder babies, right? Well, that's clearly a straw man argument, because people who are pro-abortion precisely don't think that abortion is murder. I mean, that's what the debate itself is about. So we have to be careful about these sorts of straw man arguments. They're quite common. Another one here is known as the missing the point fallacy, and here's the Latin, ignoratio elenchi. And the missing the point fallacy is a very particular, special form of fallacy of relevance. It occurs when an argument supports one particular conclusion, but then a different, although vaguely related conclusion is actually what's drawn. So this is the idea when an argument is given, but the conclusion that it supports is very close, but not the same. That is, it misses the point. the evidence misses the point. So let me see if I can give you an example. Crimes of theft and robbery have been increasing at an alarming rate lately. The conclusion is obvious. We need to reinstate the death penalty, right? Wait a second here, right? Crimes of theft and robbery, the fact that there are crimes and that these crimes are occurring at an increasingly alarming rate, that could actually infer a number of different conclusions, namely that maybe there needs to be more, more resources put towards crime or something like this. But jumping to the idea that the death penalty is the only way to solve crimes of theft and robbery, that's irrelevant, right? The death penalty is related to the idea of punishment, but maybe there's a punishment conclusion, but not the death penalty. You can see here that the premises sort of miss the point, or the conclusion's missing the point of the premises. Here's another one. Abuse of the welfare system is rampant nowadays. Our only alternative is to abolish the whole system. Well, wait a second here, right? The fact that there's abuse in the welfare system and it's rampant infers that we need to have reform, but going from reform to abolishing the system altogether, that seems to also be missing the point, right? So that's the missing the point fallacy. The red herring fallacy is very similar, and some people say it really is a type of missing the point. So it can also be called the ignoratio elenchi. But this is the idea of being led astray by a false scent. Actually, the term comes from the British philosophers, and in British society in the 19th century, hunting dogs, you would have a red herring, right? You'd have hunting dogs, and sometimes the hunting dog would follow the wrong scent. He'd follow the scent of a red herring. And so the idea here is sometimes in arguments, someone gives a conclusion, or they give you an argument that sort of takes you astray, right? So here's the specifics. The red herring fallacy is committed when the arguer diverts the attention of the reader or listener by changing the subject to a different, but sometimes subtly related argument. He or she then finishes by drawing a conclusion about a different issue by merely presuming that some conclusion's been established. So for instance, imagine someone says this. Environmentalists are continually harping about the dangers of nuclear power. Unfortunately, electricity is dangerous no matter where it comes from. Every year, hundreds of people are electrocuted by accident. Since most of these accidents are caused by carelessness, they should be avoided, and people would just exercise greater caution. Now you can see here is that all of this stuff is really leading you off track of what the environmentalists are really concerned with when they talk about nuclear power. You can see essentially what they've done is whoever's arguing this has just started talking about something else, leading you astray and certainly missing the point. Watch this example.
Cannot afford to pay the mortgage on their homes, their car payment. I have personal problems with the national debt, but how has it affected you? And if you have no experience in it, how can you?
Let me start this over. This is from. Sorry.
How has the national debt personally affected each of your lives? And if it hasn't, how can you honestly find a cure for the economic problems of the common people if you have no experience in what's ailing them?
Well, I think the national debt affects everybody. Obviously, it has a lot to do with interest rates. It has.
She's saying you personally. On a personal basis, how has it affected you?
Has it affected you personally?
Oh, I'm sure it has. I love my grandchildren. I want to think that.
Now I'm just going to stop it right there because I'm not sure if this is the best example for the red herring fallacy, but you can see here she's asking this question about the national debt, and actually if you watch the whole video, what President Bush, this is the first President Bush does, is he first starts talking about interest rates, and then then he starts talking about his grandchildren and education, right? But he doesn't actually answer the actual question. So this is an example of a red herring fallacy, where in this very, very common in politics, it's easy, every Sunday morning on these politics shows, you can watch the politicians give red herrings. They'll be asked a direct question, and they'll just sort of begin to talk about something else, right? This is what a red herring fallacy is, and it's very, very common, especially in political discourse. Now here's another, this one's a very common fallacy as well. It's called the appeal to unqualified authority. They're argumentative ad verbicundium, right? And the appeal to unqualified authority is when the argument is given that you should believe this conclusion because Joe Blow says it, and Joe Blow is an authority on the matter. Now, the appeal to unqualified authority is when someone is positing an authority who's not really an authority, right? So let me give you this example. David Duke, former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, has stated that Jews are not good Americans. They have no understanding of what America is. On the basis of Duke's authority, we must conclude that Jews in this country are un-American. Well, this is a horrible argument, and this argument is saying that Jews are not good Americans because some other guy, in this case a Ku Klux Klan Grand Wizard, says they're not good. Well, of course he's going to say that, right? Because the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan is going to be a bigoted person, almost by definition. And so they're not an authority in terms of what should count in terms of American and un-American, especially when most of us consider the Ku Klux Klan to be itself a sort of, bigoted organization. So this is not a good argument because he's not a good authority, right? Now here's another one. This is the appeal to ignorance, and this is an interesting one because this one actually occurs quite a bit. The appeal to ignorance, or the argumentative ad ignorantiam. This is when your evidence you cite is ignorance. You say, you should believe my conclusion because we don't know something else, right? And here's an example. No one has been able to prove God exists, therefore God does not exist, right? Now this argument actually sounds like one you may have actually heard. But you can see here, what's the problem with this argument? This argument is saying you should believe this conclusion because we're fundamentally ignorant of this fact. Well, wait a second. When did not knowing count as knowing something else? Right? Not knowing something means that I don't know something. I can't infer from my ignorance that something else is the case. Right? Ignorance doesn't prove that God doesn't exist. It just proves that I don't know God exists. And I just realized there should be an E there, so that bothers me. So here's another example, just to be fair to our on the other hand, right? Someone could also say, no one's disproven God's existence, therefore he must exist. God must exist since no one's been able to disprove God's existence. Well, this is just as bad, right? Because this argument says that you should believe this conclusion because we're in a state of ignorance regarding whether or not we can prove God's existence. Ignorance should never be used to justify a claim, right? That's the appeal to ignorance. And this argument is pretty common, actually. The next fallacy is known as the hasty generalization. Sometimes it's understood as the problem of the accident fallacy conversely, right? Remember that accident fallacy is when you take a general rule and misapply it. The hasty generalization fallacy is when I overly generalize about an entire group, and then from that generalization I try to understand particular cases, right? So here's an example. 10 Arab Muslims hijacked planes and crashed them into the World Trade Center in New York City on September 11, 2001. It's clear that Muslims hate America and resort to violence, right? Well, that argument is saying that is trying to make a conclusion about all of these people, every Muslim in the world, which is millions of people, based upon what 10 other people have done, right? So you can see I'm generalizing too quickly. So you can say that any fallacy is a hasty generalization fallacy that uses stereotypes, for instance, right? Now, another type of argument, here I'm just giving you the examples because we're running through a lot of time here because there's a lot of them, is the false cause argument. The false cause argument, well, let me give you an example. The false cause argument occurs when I want to prove a conclusion, but I point to a cause that's not really the cause of that effect, right? So, for instance, an argument about rain dancing, right? It's going to start raining because the rain dancers just came and did their rain dance. Well, that's a false cause argument because rain dancing doesn't cause the rain to fall. But here's another example, right? During the past 2 months, every time that the cheerleaders have worn blue ribbons in their hair, the team's been defeated. Therefore, to prevent defeats in the future, the cheerleaders should get rid of those blue ribbons, right? Now, obviously that's crazy, but you can see here arguments about superstition, arguments that are about astrology, for instance, are of this type, right? Why is it that you shouldn't believe an astrologist? Because an astrologist is using arguments of false cause. And if it's not a false cause, then they're stuck with ignorance because they can't prove that it's true. So then you have an argument by ignorance, which is just as bad. Okay. Another common argument is fallacy, is known as the slippery slope fallacy. And the slippery slope fallacy says that if we do one thing, that's going to cause a whole series of events, a chain reaction of events that's going to result in something catastrophic. And therefore, we shouldn't believe or do that thing that we first posited. Here's an example. Sort of, you start at step one, and if you agree to step one, it gets you to disaster. Therefore, you should reject the argument for step one, right? So let me give you an example here so you can see how one works. Right? Attempts to outlaw pornography threaten basic civil rights and should be summarily abandoned. If pornography is outlawed, censorship of newspapers is only a short step away. After that, there'll be censorship of textbooks, speeches, the contents of lectures delivered by university professors. Complete mind control by the central government will be the inevitable result. Right? So you can see this argument saying that if we do one thing, that is outlaw pornography, that's going to result in mind control and total centralization and censorship. And that's the inevitable result. Well, wait a second. Just because you do this, that is outlaw pornography, that doesn't mean you'll necessarily end up with disaster. Now, again, since it's an informal fallacy, inductive reasoning, it could be the case. So some slippery slope fallacies really do turn out to be true, but a lot of them don't. But generally speaking, when people make these slippery slope arguments, we should be suspicious of the reasoning, okay? And here's what I want to do now, actually, is I want to give you an example of a couple of these fallacies that I've talked about in some of these videos. So this is a good slippery slope fallacy.
Comrades, good news from the Western Front. Our glorious revolution is starting to take hold. Oh, the revolution of change. Our fearless leader has just signed in S-chips, and earlier today, he spoke out against capitalism. Listen up.
As part of the reforms we're announcing today, top executives at firms receiving extraordinary help from U.S. taxpayers will have their compensation capped at $500,000, a fraction of the salaries that have been reported recently.
Now, those capitalists will say that the mother country shouldn't decide anyone's salary. Only because, those capitalists will say they shouldn't have been bailed out in the first place. But what would you expect a capitalist to say? Also in the news today, our workers are uniting.
I'll just stop it there. But you can see here, what this news commentator is doing is he's making an implicit argument. The implicit argument is that if we have caps on bonus pay, right, then we're going to it's going to lead to the case where we have socialism and communism and all those sorts of things, and we'll start calling each other comrades and so on and so forth. You can see it's a slippery slope argument. He's saying that just because we do one thing, it's going to result in this disaster, the collapse of our society and sort of American culture, right? But that's a slippery slope argument because it precisely is saying, listen, just because you do one thing, that is have a cap on executive pay, that doesn't mean you're going to go all the way down to where you have a totalitarian state. Now, you could, but it's highly unlikely, right? And that's what makes it a weak argument. That's what makes it a fallacious argument. Now, if we knew about other sorts of chain reactions, maybe we could make slippery slope arguments that are more valid, right? Or more cogent, I should say. But not all of them. So let's go move here next. Let's go down here to the next one. So the next fallacy to talk about is the fallacy of weak analogy. And the fallacy of weak analogy occurs when you have an analogical argument, and analogy is when you say something is to this thing as this thing is to this. So you have an analogy set up. But a weak analogy is when the properties you're trying to transfer from one analogy don't really make sense in the other analogy. So let me give you an example of the pocket watch argument for God's existence. Right? The idea here is that, well, imagine you were walking on the beach and you suddenly picked up a pocket watch, right? Would you think that that pocket watch was a piece of shell life? or that it was created by something. You would think, well, because it's contrived and is complicated in its mechanics, that means that there must be a watchmaker. It's not natural. It's not created simply through natural means. So the idea here is that if you have a watch, there must be a watchmaker. So if you have a world and the world is complex, there must also be a world maker, right? This is a very famous argument by analogy for God's existence. Just as there's watches and watchmakers, there must be worlds and world makers, right? So how does the argument work? Well, the structure of argument looks like this. It says we have a certain sort of entity, watches and watchmakers, and there's certain features, right? And one of the features here is one of the properties of this analogy is we're trying to transfer it over here to this analogy. So we're saying that just as the watches to watchmakers, so too there must be a world maker. There must be an implicit Z feature in this entity as well. And so that's how analogical arguments work. But the question though is, are they good arguments, right? Would this be a fallacy? Well, the problem though is if you take the watch to watchmaker and world to world argument, there's a number of problems. One is that the argument for God's existence is that since there's a watch, there must be a watchmaker, but there's not just one watchmaker, is there? Right? In the first analogy, what we have is, when we talk about watches, is there could be multiple watchmakers who work together. That is, for instance, Rolex. If it's a Rolex watch, there could be a whole team of people at Rolex making those watches. So does that mean when I'm talking about there being a world, I mean there could be multiple world makers? Is there a team of people? Well, people who make the argument for God's existence using this argument don't think that. So you can see here, you've got it under what size does the idea of watches and watchmakers, is that really analogical to the notion of the world? Another example is, notice that when we talk about watches in the example of the seashell example, right? The only reason you recognize that there's a watchmaker is because there's some things in which there is no maker, right? So think about like this. If you say that the reason I recognize that the watch is not just a piece of shell is because I recognize that shells aren't made by anyone. But go over here to the world, and when I say that there's a world and that the world has a certain sort of pattern and certain sort of intelligence in it or something, analogically, the only way I could know that there's design features is by saying that there are things that can't be designed. But the whole idea of the second part of the analogy is to say that the entire universe is like that. So you can see here that analogically they're disanalogous, right? And now, of course, you can see here whether or not an argument is a weak analogy or not ultimately depends upon how supportive how close of a relationship the two analogies have. Okay. So here's what I want to do now is I want to watch a couple videos, and I want you to watch these and think, what is the fallacy being committed? Because each one of them there's a fallacy. So let's watch a couple videos here. So here's one right here. Or think about the arguments that are given.
They had personally raped, cut off ears, cut off heads.
The accusations that John Kerry made against the veterans who served in Vietnam was just devastating.
Randomly shot at civilians.
And it hurt me more than any physical wounds I had.
Cut off limbs, blown up bodies.
That was part of the torture, was to sign a statement that you had committed war crimes.
Razed villages in fashion reminiscent of Genghis Khan.
John Kerry gave the enemy for free what I and many of my comrades in North Vietnam in the prison camps.
Now, we'll just stop there. What fallacy is being committed there? Well, this is actually a campaign ad from when John Kerry ran for president in 2004. Obviously, a campaign ad against John Kerry. But you can see here, they're arguing that he'd be a bad president because of his own personal biography, his circumstances. So this is an ad hominem circumstantial, ultimately, if you watch the whole video. All right, so here's another. By the way, these are all campaign ads because every campaign ad has a fallacy in it. This is a very famous campaign attack ad, I think by the first George Bush.
Bush and Dukakis on crime.
Yeah, that's right.
Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
Now that actually campaign is very famous because it actually destroyed Dukakis' chances to win for the presidency in the 90s. Now, what is that argument saying? That argument is saying that he's weak on crime because he had prison passes, and Willie Horton committed murder while on a prison pass. So therefore, Dukakis thinks that criminals should be out and about and committing crimes. That's ultimately what the argument say, that the commercial is saying. But of course, is any of that true? This is an example of a straw man argument, right? Because here they're saying that this is what Willie Horton thinks, that murderers and rapists should be roaming the streets, right? That's not really what Dukakis thinks, right? But you can see here that once people got that idea in their head, it actually ruined his campaign ad. So these informal fallacies like this, this argument here is a good example of how, even though it's not persuasive, it can really actually have an effect. And here's, let's see, do I have any more? I thought I had one more video here to show you. This is one of my favorite, actually, the other campaign ad. This is one of my favorite campaign ads, but it does commit a fallacy. So let's watch it.
An important policy message from Governor Mike Huckabee. My plan to secure the border? 2 words. Chuck Norris.
Mike Huckabee's a lifelong hunter who'll protect our Second Amendment rights.
There's no chin behind Chuck Norris's beard, only another fist.
Mike Huckabee wants to put the IRS out of business.
When Chuck Norris does a push-up, he isn't lifting himself up. He's pushing the earth down.
Life's a principled, authentic conservative.
Chuck Norris doesn't endorse. He tells America how it's gonna be. I'm Mike Huckabee, and I approve this message. So did Chuck. Chuck Norris approved.
Okay, now I actually really like that campaign ad because I think it's really funny and comical. But what fallacy does it commit? It commits the fallacy of appeal to unqualified authority, right? Chuck Norris is not an authority in terms of who would be the best president in the United States. And to make an entire campaign ad saying that he is the authority, well, this clearly commits the fallacy of unqualified authority. Now, I think ultimately the reason that ultimately is people, I think that they recognize that people don't really think that Chuck Norris is an authority. And so it's actually sort of self-referential and playing with the idea of an appeal to unqualified authority. But strictly speaking, it's fallacious, right? It's not a reason to vote for Mike Huckabee. At least it's not a reason that's relevant, right, in terms of it being a fallacy of relevance. So anyway, that's enough. That's where I'm going to conclude today's session. We've looked at a lot of different fallacies, fallacies of relevance and fallacies of weak induction. But one of the things we've seen is that there are many different types of fallacies, and we could keep going here, but that they're very common actually. But that ultimately for us, I'm hoping that as we continue throughout the course, I'm hoping that we'll begin to continually be able to spot more and more false types of reasoning or fallacious arguments. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys online. Bye.